Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. We got a great brand new show tonight. This is your host, Pael Metsa, and we were speaking over the phone to a fella by the name of John Kruth. John is a musician, writer, journalist who recently received the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for an article he wrote called Ceremonies Against the Coronavirus, featuring Bashir Attar and the master musicians of Jujuka. John has a storied career, spent a lot of time in New York City, where he's speaking to us from tonight. He's written 9 or 10 books, articles. He's a performer who's performed in concert with legendary folks like Allen Ginsberg, Laurie Anderson, Sam Shepard, Rick Danko, and John Prine. He's got a great story. I'm going to ask him about performing with John Prine in Milwaukee several years ago. And he's got a great insight into a lot of music that's on the edges of the American music experience. And we're going to start talking tonight about Bashir Attar and the master musicians of Jujuka. John Kruth, how are you tonight?
I'm great. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Paul.
It's for sure. And I had the pleasure of meeting John a couple of years ago out in New York City, where he lives part of the year, also lives part of the year in California with his lovely artist wife, Marilyn, and their cute little doggie. And so I've had a chance to hang out with him. John also spent some time in Minneapolis. Tell us a little bit about that. As we were broadcasting out of the Twin Cities, about your time in the Twin Cities.
Well, I came to Minneapolis in 1973, attended the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, was already into playing a lot of music as a teenager and growing up in New Jersey, and started a band or two around the art school and had a great time out there. The weather was a little brisk, to say the least, especially moving equipment late at night after gigs, as you know. And so I kind of migrated from... and I met a woman up in Boston who I fell in love with and moved to Boston for a while. And then I moved to Maine, which really the weather's not that different, I guess. But, I played around at the New Riverside Cafe and a Kaufman Union, extempore, trying to make that happen. And then I had a band called the Whirling Dervishes for a while, and we used to play over at, I think that was Merrimack's before it became the Artist Quarter. Cross paths with Dave Ray, and hey, there was a great music scene there, Suicide Commandos were coming up, and I remember going down to see this guy playing really unbelievable funky guitar, dancing around in his underwear. He turned out to be Prince, and so it was a great scene, and I always loved Minneapolis, and I've come back here and there over the years. So that was really my time there, mostly making art, doing photography, and having a band on the side, an art school band, of course.
And John, we found out when we were hanging in New York that we had a great mutual friend, one of the greatest artists to come out of Minneapolis, the great Aldo Moroni.
Oh, yeah, Aldo was a pal of mine, and actually when I was a truly a starving artist, the summer of Watergate, and he was working over there at, the Black Forest Inn. I used to meet him around the back in the alleyway, and he would give me a couple of packages of food to make sure that I was still, functioning.
And you just recently Facebook messaged me a great picture of Aldo. Tell the people a little bit about that photo.
Oh, boy, I think that was the summer of 73 or 74. I can't remember now. But he lived over on Stevens Avenue, and he was growing some pretty tall weed in the backyard. And the neighbors called the police on him, and he went back out and pulled it all out. It's really a funny picture. He's standing there frowning, holding a huge batch of marijuana, and he's got no shirt on, and his belly's kind of hanging over his shorts, and he's just giving me this grimace. It's just such a classic picture at this point. He's such a sweet, great, creative cat.
Yeah, and his legacy lives on. John Kruth, tell us about the master musicians of Jajouka. They've been in my radar for years. Of course, Brian Jones kind of took some international prominence. We're going to be listening to some of that at the end of one of these segments on the Wall of Power Radio Hour. But and I've been reading a lot about the Rolling Stones lately as they kick off their Charlie Watts List tour. And so I've been reading once again about Brian Jones and these master musicians of Jajouka. So tell the people out there in the listening audience about these fabulous musicians.
Well, when I was 15, I bought this record of strange music from Morocco, and it was recorded by Brian Jones on his fabled trek to the Rift Mountains in 1967. And that became the Pipes of Pan at Jajouka, and it just was otherworldly, just completely unlike anything I'd ever heard. And, it was kind of unnerving, the gaita, which is an oboe carved from the apricot tree that grows in the Rift Mountains. It's a pretty hard, piercing sound if you're not used to it. And basically, it's a group of oboe players with drummers is the main sound that you hear. And it was just, I think at the time that I was like 15 or 16, I was searching for something different from all the regular rock music that I was hearing at the time. Not that it wasn't great stuff. But so Jones, he was one of my biggest heroes growing up. Playing the dulcimer, sitar, recorder, cello, every Stones album, Brian added something really great to and broadened their musical horizons and always added something to it. And so when that record came out, it was just mystifying. It was mesmerizing. It was unlike anything else. And I also was a flute player, and the master musicians of Jajouka have their own kind of flute that they play that's really beautiful. And I actually got to play Bashir Attar's father's flute many years later. I first met the master musicians in 1995 when they did a tour 25 years after the release of the Brian Jones record. They toured America, and I was in San Francisco. And I just went up to Bashir after the show, and I introduced myself, and I told him I was waiting 25 years to see him play. And,
Wow.
He was like, "Oh, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the music," And I mean, the music had reached so many people. It wasn't just Brian Jones. Quickly, soon after that, the great writer who was always an inspiration to me, Robert Palmer from the New York Times, critic at the New York Times, and a member of a very cool, funky band from Hoboken called the Insect Trust. He played clarinet and flutes and stuff. Took Ornette Coleman over there. And they recorded, I think that was around 1973, he recorded Midnight Sunrise. He recorded hours and hours, but the track that was released on his Dancing in Your Head, which is one of my favorite albums, that was released, years later, and just a brilliant recording, and Ornette, always one of my favorites, and I was really lucky to know Ornette for about the last 10 years of his life and get to play with him a bit. So
and
this
John,
was...
John, I have to jump in. Don't you have one of Ornette Coleman suit coats with his name sewn into the inside. Or maybe that.
How do you know about this?
Another buddy of mine. Anyway, took a left turn that went nowhere. But welcome to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. So,
wow.
What was
Ornette? Yeah, so I got to meet Bashir again. I crossed paths with Bashir when he came to New York. Soon after I met him in San Francisco, I was back in New York. Bashir was in New York at this little store on Prince Street called the Gates of Marrakesh. And it was really weird because I always carry an instrument with me. Always. I mean, a harmonica, a penny whistle, something. But he was like, hey, do you want to go to a party? And I didn't have an instrument with me. It was like really strange. And I was like, look, I got to go home and get something. Okay, we're gonna leave in like a half an hour. And I got in this van, and here I am driving up with the master musicians of Jajouka in this van that they emptied out and put a beautiful Moroccan rug on the floor of. And the entire way up to Briarcliff Manor, where we're going up to this party, we're playing in the van with the drummers and the flute players and the whole thing. We're just playing in this big van while this guy is driving us up to Briarcliff Manor. And that night we played all night, and at about 4 o'clock in the morning or so, we finally took a break, and everybody was sort of taking a nap, and I picked up the flute that Bashir was playing, and I said, is this your father's flute? Is this the flute I heard on the Brian Jones record when I was 15 years old? And he looks at me like, yes, of course.
Wow.
And I go, well, could I play it? And he's like, yes, sure, of course. And he's just like watching me with these, like, he is so intense. He's like a U-boat captain, man. I mean, Bashir has not only kept this band together for all these years after his father passed, but he's really helped keep the village of Jajouka together. And, and then when COVID hit, this is what led to the article. When COVID hit, I called him to see how he was doing, how they were faring through all of this. And he was living in Paul Bowles, the great writer, Paul Bowles' apartment in Tangier. He was like holed up. He was holed up in Paul Bowles' apartment, and he was telling me, the streets are empty. They patrol the streets. They were much more strict in Morocco about masks and spreading COVID and all of that than we were. And so, and we had this really great, I had a chance to interview him once again because I've written about them a number of times over the years. And this one was really something else because, he was holed up in the apartment. And he really gave me a great history of the music and why the music is so important. And this is a group that William S. Burroughs called the 4,000-year-old rock and roll band.
Wow. Well, let's listen to a little bit of that Master Musicians of Jajouka that was presented by Brian Jones. And then we'll have John Kruth on for the rest of the show tonight on the Wall of Power Radio Hour.
Wall of Power Radio Hour.
Welcome back to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Pael Metsa. My guest for the whole show tonight, John Kruth, musician, author, beatnik, and all-around cool cat. John, so what did it feel like to finally the music, the Master Musicians of Jajouka by way of Rolling Stones really affected you? What did it feel like to finally meet Bashir Attar for the first time? It must have been pretty heavy.
Well, it's great because, first of all, Bashir is the son, and I had been listening to the father and it was just really great to see that the tradition was carried on and everything like that. And, I felt immediately connected to it because this was music that I'd been listening to since I was 15 years old. I told Bashir, I said, that flute music that you guys play, there's a track called "Your Eyes Are Like a Cup of Tea." I mean, that's like a E. Cummings title or something,
Right.
And right. And I said, that music is deeply seductive stuff. I used to bring girls up to my room when I was like 16, 17 years old and see if I could, kiss them while listening to this music, And he just cracked up. He just was like, he was like trying to imagine some teenager in the suburbs.
Some white guy.
Yeah, right. But we had a really interesting, relationship pretty much off the bat. He understood that I understood. And the fact that I was not only just a writer, but a musician as well, So one thing that really helped solidify my relationship with these guys is that one of their shows was they played like an entire week at the Knitting Factory. I think this was in the late 1990s, like their second or third trip to America. And they played like an entire week at the downtown club, the Knitting Factory. And I was there every night backstage, and so was Elliot Sharp. Now, Elliot Sharp is a really brilliant cat, an amazing guitar player, plays reeds, and also a composer. I mean, I don't know how many albums Elliot's made, over 50, I would imagine. And so Elliot's there every night, like he's on the other side of the room, I'm on this side of the room. Hey, how are you doing? Good, good. By the end of the week, we had started a band. So, and then we wound up recording an album. So the master musicians brought us together, and Bashir recorded on an Elliott record, and he also recorded on one of my albums with a band that I had for 9 years called Tribeca-stan, and he played on one of our albums as well. So this has been an interesting ride on both. On many levels, on a musical level as well as, writing about the importance of this music and what the world, would be without this music. I mean, the kings of Morocco used to fear that if the master musicians ever stopped playing, the world would end.
Some people
right?
feel that.
I mean, that's heavy stuff.
So I'm very anxious to see this new Todd Haynes documentary on the Velvet Underground, which I believe is coming out sometime this month. And it's interesting because it talks about the cultural milieu that Andy Warhol and the Velvets came through in the mid to late 60s in New York City. So my question, John Kruth, is what was the audience in New York City at the Knitting Factory for the week-long stand with the master musicians? It must have been a room full of real hipsters.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm currently writing an article about the great guitarist James Blood Ulmer, who worked with Ornette Coleman, and they had their whole style or theory of music called harmolodics. And as I said, Ornette recorded and went to Jijuka and played with them. And one of the things that Blood really taught me this week is that music has been around before mankind. Music existed before mankind. Now, I know this is a little bit abstract, and I'm stretching a few people's heads, and I can already see them out in radio land rolling their eyes. But take this for a moment. Music existed before man, and man invented various instruments to try to capture this spirit, this jinn. D-J-I-N-N, I believe they call it, a jinn, a spirit. They try to capture this spirit. And you can hear a lot of guys out there playing all kinds of notes, shredding all kinds of notes, whether it's Eddie Van Halen or whoever. And sometimes it's great, and sometimes it really doesn't work. And then sometimes you can hear somebody play one note, and it'll cut you right to your heart, just like John Lee Hooker or Muddy Waters did. So it's about harnessing a spirit. And the thing that was interesting about about James Blood Ulmer, seeing him in the early 80s, late 70s, he was playing punk rock clubs. Now, this is a rather large black man from South Carolina with a real harsh attack on the guitar, that the punks could dig. And they dug stuff like Captain Beefheart and Pill and James Chance and the Contortions, but this guy was directly connected to the deep root of the music. And that's what I'm trying to get to with the master musicians of Jajouka. It might sound very foreign, it might sound really harsh, it might sound really weird, or whatever it is. Because this is not Afrobeat. This is not like very sweet, bouncy kind of reggae Afrobeat, which I love. It's not like that. This is a cleansing, ritual kind of spirit music that's really, really that's cathartic to listen to. It's not just about listening to music as an appreciation. You go through something. It puts you through something. And I think that the people that were willing to show up night after night to see the master musicians of Jajouka, they were transforming the knitting factory into a sweat lodge, man. You were not the same person when you came walking out of there after you heard that music. And that's the whole power and the beauty and the spirit of this music that was here before, I think the Native Americans, the flute players from Hopi, will tell you the same thing. The spirit was here before, and I have a feeling after we screw ourselves out of this beautiful life on this beautiful planet due to our greed and pollution and all of that, I have a feeling that the music is still going to be here.
That's very well put, John. Now, and it sounds
Did
like
that bend your head a little bit, Paul?
Yeah, well, my head's bent to begin with, as you know. Speaking of bent heads, when I called you last night to do a little pre-interview, you talked to me about something that I'd love for you to tell my listeners about, and it's this whole concept that the master musicians of Jajouka have called 55. Tell us about that.
Ooh, the 55. I was surprised to see that listed as 55 on there we were trying to track down the tracks on YouTube, and one of the tracks was called 55. Now, from what I understand about 55 from Bashir, and sometimes things get a little lost in the translation, but 55, from what I understand, is a very spiritually based music that they only play live in Jajouka, that you have to go to the Jajouka to hear it. And that they, for the most part, from what I understand, they don't want people to record the music. They, as they say, with 55, they can't be responsible for what happens to people when they hear this music. And now you have to understand, when they play this music, they got this music from, I believe the story is, Attar was the first who heard the music being played by Boujalud. Boujalud is like Pan, like a ghost, not a ghost, like a spirit of like the goat boy, like half goat, half boy, like Pan. And Pan supposedly roamed northern Morocco. And Attar, who was like a goat herder, played for Boujalud to dance. Now, the thing about Boujalud, when Boujalud danced over the years, it would usually happen in the spring after the winter, like a Pan festival, like May Day or something like that in the West. Women who could not conceive would stand in a circle around Boujalud. and Boujalid would have these switches in his hands, and he would dance to this music in like a trance, in like a circle, and then he would maybe like focus on one woman and then start to chase her and whip her, with the switch a couple of times, and that woman would then, of course, conceive. And supposedly people that were insane or having some kind of mental illness were cured by Boujalid whipping them with a switch. And so this is ritual music. This is not, we're not talking about popular music. We're talking about music that has a purpose to heal. And so 55, from what I understand, has 55 scales within the music. So, I mean, this is all really, when you first find out about Indian music, it's like, we're so limited in our approach to music. We have basically 2 beats in the West, 4/4, and waltz. And all you got to do is go to India and start finding out that there are all these other beats and all these other, accents and tempos and all of that. And I've played with Moroccan musicians off and on for, 25, 30 years now. And it's really funny because once I think like I'm on the train with them, like I'm in it with them, they're usually the moment that I think like, okay, I got this. I'm in there. I'm in the flow. And all of that, the music usually takes a left turn and I don't know where I am.
Well, you could say what you want about 3/4 time, which of course is both waltz and polka time, but it's really makes it easier for people with one leg shorter than the other one to dance.
No, that's like 7/8 or 5/8 over in like the Balkans, 9/8. Oh my God, those are dance rhythms, and they're really you just like in the West when we would play with Tribekistan, and if we played anything in an odd time signature like that, it looked like people would just be out there breaking their legs trying to dance to it. It was always really funny.
We've got John Kruth on tonight on the Wall of Power Radio Hour. We're going to listen to a little music by the master musicians of Jijuka and then have John on for one more set.
Wall of Power Radio Hour.
Welcome back to the last set of the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Pael Metsa. We have all-around cool cat John Kruth on tonight talking about an article he wrote about the master musicians of Jijuka. John, before we get going on this set, tell us where they can access your recent article, which just last week won the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for excellence in music writing.
I am they can find it on pleasekillme.com. Please Kill Me. Please Kill Me was a really great book by Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain, and an oral history of punk. It's really one of my favorite books ever written about the whole punk era. It's just great. And if you haven't checked that out, please check out that book. And I think that Please Kill Me as a .com is a really great site. I mean, they go into everything, punk, New York, but also, beat poetry. They're really into art. They're into all kinds of stuff. I think it's one of the coolest sites out there, and I'm really glad to be part of it. And so they can find it there. And I mean, I'm on Facebook, John Kruth, and it's posted there, and you can find it there. And I've written about the Masters a number of times over the years for different publications. They're near and dear to my heart. I love the music and I love the history and find that it's just very important. And, they've made attempts and recorded with all kinds of people from the Rolling Stones to they're on Continental Drift, which is a track that was on Steel Wheels. They've recorded with Peter Gabriel and as well as Steven Tyler and Joe Perry, and they've recorded with quite a few people over the years. And they have this mythological kind of, and of course Ornette Coleman, and they have this mythological kind of position in the world, but they still need to be able to deal with day in and day out things like getting old and getting to doctors and getting their teeth fixed and getting, operations and making sure that they're okay, because they live in a little remote mountain village in the Rift Mountains in outside of Tangier, and so that was part of the reason why I felt not only do I love the music, but I don't want to see it disappear, and it's really important to support the things that you love, or they will disappear.
Well, John Kruth, you've also written for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Sing Out, Fretboard Journal, Relics Magazine, and others. But you also won a Deems Taylor Award several years ago for your book on Townes Van Zandt. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was really sweet and fun and great. I mean, that really came out of the blue. The thing about the Townes Van Zandt book was that it was turned down probably at least a dozen times, and I didn't really know if it was going to get picked up. And thanks to Ben Schaefer at the Capo, he was ready and willing to take a ride on that dark horse, and it came in first. And that was the 2008 Deems Taylor Award for Best Musical Biography at Lincoln Center. And the funny thing was, they kept trying to get like Steve Earle or somebody who was a contemporary of Townes to come and play the song, and it wasn't working out, And I'm like, hey, guys, I've got, like, at that point, I had maybe 9 albums out. I know how to play Townes' songs, and I can bring in a killer band. So I got to play at Lincoln Center, and the really fun part was that to my left, receiving an award posthumously for her husband, Mr. Rogers, was Mrs. Rogers, who was just about as sweet as could be. And then to my right, was Oliver Sacks, who, I probably read just about every book by him. And I kind of came on a little too heavy. I was a little overwhelming. He was a very shy, retiring kind of guy. And I was like, man, your book, The Man Who Mistook his wife for a hat, that blew my mind, man. And he was like, oh, well, thank you very much. So that was a real stunner of a night. But unfortunately, this year, due to COVID, none of that's going to happen.
Before we get to towards the end of the segment and listen to it talk more about the master musicians of Tijuca, I had you on the Wall of Power Radio Hour a couple of years ago, and you told me an incredibly humorous story about the time you were opening for John Prine. I believe it was in Milwaukee. God. And he asked you to come up and play Paradise, including inviting you to sing the song of which you knew none of the words. Tell us about that, John. Let's embarrass you a little bit.
Oh, God. Yeah. Well, I met John probably all the way back in 85. The first time I saw him was like maybe 73 in Chicago at the Earl of Old Town, doing a New Year's Eve show with Steve Goodman, and I talked with Steve a few times, and so I got to know John basically through his great producer, Jim Rooney, who did a handful of records with him and Nancy Griffith. I wound up opening some shows around the Midwest for John around 1990, I think, or 91 that was. But I had opened for him before that, too. But in particular, this one show was in Oshkosh, Wisconsin at the, at the Opera House there. And I opened up for him, and I'm playing my mandolin. That was my main instrument at that time. I'm playing mandolin and some guitar, and I'm doing my singer-songwriter bit. And then he comes out, and he's, there ain't but the one, John Prine. I mean, there's just one of him, and he was just such a funny, sweet, great, singular character. And, he told me, look, I'm going to call you out for a song at the end. And I was like, great. So he calls me out, and we're standing there doing an encore of Paradise. And it's like, I knew the words to that song back in the 70s, but, I started writing my own music and playing other stuff. And, he put me on the spot. He just turned to me and he goes, sing one. And I just went, and I played a mandolin solo. And at the end of the song, the whole place for singing, right? The whole place. And he turns and he says right on the microphone, damn. I turn to him and I say, hey, sing one. And he's the only guy in the place that doesn't know the words.
A couple of years ago after John died, I started an effort that I'd like to invite people to sign. Tell your friends, John Kruth. It's called JohnPrineStamp.com. John Prine, of course, was a mailman for years, and I just really think the United States Postal Service should designate a stamp to John Prine. So you go to JohnPrineStamp.com, sign in.
Cool.
We've got over 3,000 signatures. When we get up to 10,000, we're going to present it to the USPS.
That's so great. That's beautiful. Yeah. I want to post that on my Facebook page. I got to do that.
Please do.
That's great. Now, John, I love that.
Well, cool. So, John, I've got so much respect for what you do as a musician and a writer. How have you dealt with COVID? What has been keeping you occupied? Well,
I did make one solo album, completely solo, finally, after all these years. I'm a multi-instrumentalist, so I play mandolin, banjo, guitar, flute, harmonica, some sitar. I actually work at the sitar. But I was never really much of a bass player, so I started practicing bass a lot, and you wouldn't call me to sing harmony, but I'm not bad. I'm okay. I kind of do my Keith Richards-y kind of harmonies. And so I practiced this stuff, and I recorded a solo album called Love Letters from the Lazaretto. A lazaretto, if you know, is like where people with like TB would go back in, during the plague and everything like that in Italy and in Southern Europe. So, it's like Love Letters from the Lazaretto. It's up on Bandcamp, and I recorded 13 songs that I wrote and played all the instruments this time. Instead of usually just like 4 or 5, I played all of them and recorded that, and that was a lot of fun. But really, my main thing in order to keep alive has not been playing, sort of busking on Facebook like a lot of my friends have been doing. I just couldn't do it. It just felt too lonely or something, and so I really started writing full time, because writing was always part time for me. It was always about the music was first, then I would write when I had the time. And I write because I love something and I want to turn somebody else onto it. I don't write because it's just simply either about money or I don't have a smarmy attitude, I hope, and put stuff down. I write because I love stuff and love music and want to present that music and think that it's important and that other people need to know about it. And like my first book on Rasson Roland Kirk, the great jazz saxophonist, is coming out again in another month or two. And after it came out 20 years ago. And I don't know how many people I interviewed for that book who are no longer with us. Really great record producers. Allen Ginsberg's in that book. Ken Kesey's in that book. All these great people that were in that book, they're no longer with us. So it keeps the voices alive. There was only one other thing I really meant to say about the master musicians of Suzuka that I didn't get to, and that is the album Apocalypse Across the Sky It was recorded by Bill Laswell, the great producer, bass player, in the early 90s. And that's a tremendous album to check out. And who wrote the liner notes but William S. Burroughs. And then there's another live album of theirs that's really great called Between the Mountains. And that was recorded live at one of Peter Gabriel's WOMAD festivals. So these guys, they've had some pretty, they've had a pretty great ride, but they need our help.
John, fascinating stuff. I had the honor of backing up Ken Kesey at the Walker Arts Center in 1990. He had
oh, wow.
a song and then another children's book, and he was doing a children's performance, which is a lot of hippie mom and dad, their kids on Saturday morning, and I met him the night before, and I got a call, and he said, Metsa. I go, yeah. He goes, Kesey. It was like getting a call from Captain Kangaroo at 8 a.m. He goes, you want to back me up at my show today, which was in 2 hours. I lived right around the corner from the Walker Arts Center. I said, no problem. So I showed down there, and he's in full acid test regalia. His wife, Faye, was with the lights. And I said, Ken, it was literally, the show was in 50 minutes. I said, what do you want me to play? He said, no riffs or chords from the last 10,000 years and end with heavy noise.
Well, okay, he was the guy that sponsored the acid test, and, the Grateful Dead came together under his guise. So, he was a sweet, brilliant, really off-the-wall guy, and, the world needs more Ken Keseys. My God, his writing was always great. And just that guy really made it happen. He was one of those great guys that made things happen, and the world so needs people like that.
That's a great way to end this interview on the Wall of Power Radio. The world needs more Ken Keseys, and thank God for people like Bashir Attar and my guest tonight, John Kruth. John, this has been so enjoyable.
It's always a pleasure to hang with you, man, because I know you know.
And give my best to your lovely partner, Marilyn.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. The show was produced by Pael Metsa, engineered by Brett Johnson. We'd like to thank our guest, John Kruth, for a lovely interview. We also want to thank one of our great sponsors, School of Rock, Eden Prairie. My new book, Alphabet Jazz, a collection of prose and poetry and song lyrics, will be coming out in September, so check it out at paelmetsa.com. And remember, like my dad used to tell me, remember to be kind and make someone happy.
Someday, the high and the mighty will fall.